Hi, I'm Mimi Geerges. North Korea has had a nuclear weapons program since the 1980s. Now they're working on technology to deliver those weapons as far as they can. So why hasn't the US or China been able to stop them?
Not only does Kim Jong Un have nuclear weapons, missiles to launch those weapons, but he also has chemical weapons and biological weapons. So we have to keep all these things in mind. There are multiple threats here.
Welcome to the Mimi Geerges Show. The latest North Korean launch was an intermediate-range ballistic missile, which could reach the American military base in Guam. South Koreans have just elected a new leader who promotes a more conciliatory approach with the North, and President Trump has said he'd be, quote, honored to meet Kim Jong Un, one of the world's worst dictators. Joining me to discuss what to do about North Korea is Anthony Ruggiero, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Harry Kazianis, Director of Defense Studies at the Center for the National Interest. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Harry, would North Korea ever launch a nuclear missile at another country?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think we have to take a step back, though, from saying something like that and understand what the circumstances would be. I think Kim Jong Un is the type of person who, if he felt threatened, if he felt that he was pushed into a corner, that he would potentially strike. Now,
so give me the scenario.
Sure.
How would war break out on the Korean Peninsula?
Sure. I think the most obvious way that war would break out would probably be by accident, to be honest with you. I mean, a simple scenario would have Kim Jong Un testing a missile, for example. And let's say that missile accidentally landed in downtown Seoul, landed maybe on the outskirts of Tokyo, in some major metropolitan area. The South Koreans and the Japanese, I think, would feel very strongly that they would have to strike back in some way. And that would push the North Koreans to want to strike back. So this can all unravel very, very easily. We have to keep in mind that the tensions on the Korean Peninsula are essentially a huge powder keg. Not only does Kim Jong Un have nuclear weapons, missiles to launch those weapons, but he also has chemical weapons and biological weapons. So we have to keep all these things in mind. It just isn't one threat. There are multiple threats here.
So you're saying South Korea or Japan would respond?
Absolutely.
And of course that would bring us in, wouldn't
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, what would we do? Like use nuclear weapons or?
No, I mean, hopefully tensions wouldn't get that far. One thing that I would hope is that both sides would, before we get to that level, would take a step back and initiate some sort of talks to sort of bring tensions down. But we have to keep in mind, we don't really have great connections to the North Koreans in terms of diplomatic contacts. Both countries do not have diplomatic relations. So all of these different problems and crisis points makes the situation all the more scary.
Anthony, how advanced is their nuclear weapons program?
Well, it's very advanced. I think they have had a nuclear weapons program since at least the 1960s, at least the nuclear program. And they did their first nuclear weapons test over 10 years ago. And they claim to be able to miniaturize a nuclear weapon. They're going sort of in the reverse. They're developing a nuclear weapon first, and now they have a more advanced missile program. I think is equally concerning. I mean, the launch this weekend was very concerning.
I was going to ask you, what does this last missile launch tell us?
Well, the last missile launch tells us there's a lot of theories out there. I mean, I think the best theory is that this is probably a technology demonstrator for their road mobile ICBM launch. So they're basically testing the first stage of that missile. They purposely put it at a high arc to test the re-entry vehicle. There's some rumors that there were some of the technical aspects were working after the re-entry vehicle came back into the atmosphere. So it suggests to me that they have a checklist on an ICBM and they're checking things off. And it's important to remember that one of the hardest things, the two hardest things I think are re-entry vehicle and stage separation, and they have mastered stage separation through their Taepodong 2 or Yunha 3. So they have an advancing and unfortunately rapidly advancing missile program. I mean, people forget just earlier this year, they took their submarine-launched ballistic missile, which is solid propellant and very, changes the dynamic there, and just put it on land, and it succeeded. So, without any
So
real
how
failures.
far are we from them being able to hit Los Angeles?
Well, I mean, most estimates say that they will have a limited operational capability by 2020, meaning that presumably they will have had several successful tests, and that they will have the ability to have an ICBM, presumably with a nuclear warhead, by 2020.
That's not a whole lot of time.
No, it's not, and I think that's why the Trump administration, at least publicly, has been saying that this is an urgent problem they need to solve. Unfortunately, we've kicked the can down the road for the last 10 to 12 years, which is Republicans and Democrats. I think, unfortunately, this has been a bipartisan failure. I think, if you go all the way back to the Clinton administration, we've approached this in the wrong way, and the North Koreans and the Chinese really are the ones that are winning this.
Well, we're going to talk about solutions, but I want to go way back to, and I know this sounds kind of like a childish question, but why do the North Koreans hate us so much?
Well, I think we have to do a little bit of a history lesson. We have to keep in mind that 2.5 million people died in the First Korean War. It was a savage, brutal conflict. There was atrocities on both sides. We need to take that into consideration. But the North Koreans have studied that war over and over again. And basically, they have taken their military posture and adapted it for that type of conflict.
But they're not over it? I mean, it's been like 70 years.
Well, there's a purpose for not being over it, because they can use it for propaganda to say the United States is going to come back someday. They're the puppets of the South Koreans, and this is why they have 28,000 troops down in South Korea, because they're going to do it all over again. So the propaganda value of this is very, very high for them. They can just keep recycle it and keep recycling it and use it to say, this is why you're impoverished. This is why you have nothing to eat. This is why so many people are starving on a daily basis, because
instead of the real reason, which is he's stealing everything for their military program.
Absolutely.
The last missile launch landed near Russia, not too far from Russia. And then Putin says other countries, meaning us, should, quote, avoid intimidating North Korea. That's not the tough guy approach that I'm used to from Putin.
No, I mean, this is kind of interesting. That we have to keep in mind, North Korea used to be an old satellite of the old former Soviet Union. Now, the Putin regime hasn't brought on North Korea as a full-fledged ally. They do not give the fuel, the food subsidies that the Soviet Union used to. But North Korea is sort of a useful stooge, if you will, for Putin. Keep in mind, Putin, if relations between the United States and Russia really got bad, he could start giving North Korea advanced armaments, air defense systems, missiles, whatever he wants to do. So North Korea plays sort of a useful strategic asset for the Russians. Now, whether Putin would do something like that, I don't know, but he gets to sort of hang it out there, and that makes it all the more challenging.
So let's talk about the THAAD. This is an American-built, it's called Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, and it's designed to shoot down North Korean missiles. China is against it. The new South Korean leader is against it. Why would anybody be against this defensive system that's supposed to save you from even an accidental launch, like you mentioned?
Well, the Chinese are upset about it because of the long-range radar that this has. Now, THAAD comes in two configurations: a very long-range radar that can peer into hundreds, maybe even thousands of miles into Chinese territory, or a very short range that would just peer into North Korea, basically looking for missile launches. What the Chinese are afraid is if someday, if relations between Beijing and Washington were to sour, that we would turn on this long-range radar and be able to peer into their territory.
And spy on them.
Exactly, looking for missile data, nuclear weapons data. The Americans have been very clear, we're not going to do that. Now, we could change that, of course, but the Chinese are very much afraid of the long-term threat. What they're also afraid of is that someday that we would deploy THAAD to other parts of the Asia-Pacific to basically deter the Chinese. Potential deployments to Taiwan, potential deployments to Japan, for example. So this is sort of what the long-term thread that they're basically afraid of here. As for South Korea, well, it's in terms of their domestic politics. They're very concerned that this could raise tensions even more with North Korea, which is still their brethren, we have to keep in mind. They're also very concerned because the Chinese have essentially put economic sanctions on South Korea over the last couple months and damaged their economy. So these are some of the things that are sort of playing out in the Asia-Pacific that make this a lot more challenging.
But I think nuclear weapons pointed at Seoul is kind of a bigger deal than their little domestic issues.
Absolutely. But just like in the United States, jobs matter just like they do here. So, but so far that has not been pulled out, and it is actually operational, so I have to say.
Anthony, let's talk about the money. What are North Korea's primary sources of revenue?
Well, I mean, they export, unfortunately, slave labor overseas. There are quite a few countries that employ North Koreans. They get the estimates.
Like what?
China, Russia, countries in the Middle East. There are some rumors that North Koreans may have helped build the World Cup stadiums in Qatar and Russia. There are Russians in the logging industry. The Chinese Commerce Ministry, sort of touts that North Korean laborers are inside China. A conservative estimate is $500 million a year. Some people say that's closer to $2 billion. So they have that. They have we talked earlier about illicit activities, which have included drug methamphetamines, counterfeiting U.S. currency in the past at least, cyber activities that we've seen now, and then of course proliferation, selling nuclear-related materials, if not building a reactor in Syria, and ballistic missiles that they've exported, and also conventional arms to Africa and elsewhere. So they have a wide
Nothing
range
good.
of... Nothing good. Nothing good.
It's not like they're producing anything
they
good.
export coal to China. It depends on if you believe that the Chinese have banned that. I certainly don't think they actually have. They have other exports that are sort of legitimate. But this is the problem with North Korea, is that you can't really believe that there's anything legitimate in terms of their financial transactions.
I want to ask you about cyber, because this latest ransomware virus, there's talk that North Korea was actually behind that.
That's right. There's some suggestion that the group, I think it's the Lazarus group that's associated with North Korea. North Korea has been associated with that. They essentially attacked
And this isn't
US
like a rogue group. This is like the North Korean regime.
This is part of their
employing
statecraft,
them.
right? This is part of their statecraft now, and I think they have two levels of their cyber activities. The first is, cyber-enabled economic warfare, where North Korea is positioned to attack the United States or South Korea. They showed they could do it with the Sony hack, where they essentially took down an American corporation over, a movie satire that, was okay. And then, they have the ability to use that for illicit activities now. And so they're using that with the bank heist, where they got $81 million from a Bangladesh bank. And now we're seeing with this sort of ransomware. And it's not about the small amount of money that they're going to get from it. It's the fact that they're using it as part of their statecraft for these two purposes.
So why can't China just completely cut off North Korea, and that would cripple the North Korean economy, and that would bring them to the table, and we can negotiate?
I mean, they can. They just
why
choose
won't they?
not to. I mean, part of the reason is that our interests don't match up. The Chinese are interested in managing this problem. U.S. is interested in solving it, in the sense that the Chinese just want to prevent North Korea from imploding. The sort of scenario of North Korean refugees going north into China. The United States is very focused, obviously, on its nuclear program and its missile program. North Korea's, that is. The Chinese at any time could, and it's hard to make the argument that the Chinese don't know what's going on inside their own country. They have a robust security service. They have to know what the North Koreans are doing inside China. There are Chinese individuals that are helping North Korea evade sanctions, Chinese banks that are assisting in this. This is actually what the Trump administration I have advocated for, is that they need to be designating and sanctioning these individuals inside China. I know there's always a reluctance. There's been a reluctance over the last 10 years to do it, but that's really the only way it's going to happen.
Why is there a reluctance, though?
I think the reluctance primarily is due to our broader Chinese relationship with China, this expectation that it will take down the U.S.-China relationship, the expectation that
Will it?
I don't think it will. I mean, I go back to the Iran sanctions days. I mean, people forget that between 2012 and 2015, the United States sanctioned European banks to the tune of over $12 billion in fines, to not shut down the U.S.-Europe relationship. I understand U.S.-China is very different, and the China-North Korea relationship is different. I get all of that, but this is an issue of we have to have banks that are on our side and the Chinese banks that are on our side. And that's what turned the tide on Iran, is that you had banks before companies and governments in Europe that were compliant with U.S. sanctions. It was not UN sanctions that pushed
So China is okay with a nuclear-armed North Korea?
The cynical way you could look at it is that the Chinese are okay with North Korea bogging us down in Asia as they hold the One Belt, One Road conference, where they are sort of forcing Asian countries to choose between the United States and China. And in a lot of cases, those countries are choosing China, and that's not good for the United States. And so I think the Chinese see North Korea as a sort of thorn in our side that is okay for them.
Here's what the Chinese government said after that latest missile launch. They said, quote, "All relevant parties," meaning us, should exercise restraint and do nothing to further worsen regional tensions.
Right. I mean, at this point, I could.
This is our fault.
At this point, I could write, the Chinese response, and I can write the UN response because they're all the same. The Chinese, and I think you quoted before, the Russians always get up and say it's both of our sides' fault, and we just need to get in a room, even though that hasn't worked over the last 20 years or so. And the UN always, condemns a missile launch, but no sanctions. I mean, the Chinese have been very successful in boxing us in at the UN. The only time we get sanctions is when there's a space launch or a nuclear test. Nothing else. So a significant missile test like this one that now gets U.S. territory in range, a military base in range, nothing. I would be surprised if the UN reacts in any sort of sanctions.
Harry, do you think Donald Trump should meet Kim Jong Un?
No, absolutely not. I think we have to keep in mind, we have to look at the character of this regime, and we have to be honest with ourselves. The North Korean regime is one of the most vile, nasty human rights abusers on this planet. They are the closest thing to Nazi Germany in existence today. And the statistics are quite telling. Most experts would tell you that there's somewhere between 150 to 200,000 people in prison camps. These prison camps, when different defectors have come out, and I've had the opportunity to speak to some of these folks, the conditions, I can't describe them on air. They are as brutal as you could imagine. In some instances, they're actually worse than Nazi prison camps. They test chemical weapons on their own people, from according to different defectors and those who have explained to me. I mean, these are the most vile conditions you can think of. Imagine Donald Trump taking Kim Jong Un into the Oval Office, or having Kim Jong Un come to Washington. Donald Trump has an optics problems already. Imagine how much that would be magnified. And think about it from this perspective. Would we really want to legitimize North Korea as a normal state, as what they're doing to their own people? I mean, we also have to keep in mind, too, to build these nuclear weapons, to have a 1 million-man army, to have all these tanks. They're starving their own people to do this. They're not putting in the resources to give their people a better life. They're basically letting them die so they can have this massive nuclear deterrent. So there's no way that we should be talking to Kim Jong Un. Now, should we have some sort of normal transactional talks with the North Koreans to try to lessen tensions? Unfortunately, yes, I think we do.
Do they want to talk to us?
Well, they say they do, but with the last missile test, I think basically what they did is they told us to go you-know-where, if you know what I mean. So I think they would like to have talks, but I think the only time they're going to want to talk to us is when they have a demonstrated nuclear capability to hit the United States. I think that's the only time they're going to want to talk to us, when they feel secure in their position.
I want to just go back to the sanctions for 1 minute. Is it possible that we just unilaterally punish financially anybody that does business with North Korea?
Yes, and we should have been doing this.
But why haven't we? That seems so common sense.
Someone I used to work for says, this is the Sisyphus problem on North Korea. As soon as you get that boulder up the hill, it comes back down on you. And it's not clear why we don't have the same attitude we had on Iran. I think people need to remember that I think everybody thinks that on Iran sanctions, it was the UN sanctions. It was not the UN sanctions, it was the US sanctions. The UN only designated one Iranian bank. The UN did not restrict oil for Iran. It was the US that did that. The US is the one that restricted, bilateral trade with Iran.
And you think if we started doing that, so sanctioning individuals, that this could turn things around in North Korea?
Yes, I mean, it's proven that, I think the issue here is that the North Koreans are good at hiding what they're doing. They're using third-party individuals, Chinese and others, to hide their approach to it. And the Iranians did the same thing. And the only way that tide turned was the United States, multiple occasions, would expose all those front companies. And that it's not easy work. I'm not suggesting it's easy work, and I'm not suggesting North Korea is on the scale of Iran, but it's an attitude change. Now, it sounds like the administration is saying the right thing. Ambassador Haley said earlier this week, you're either with us or you're with North Korea. That's the right attitude, but it needs to be followed up with action. I mean, this administration has only designated, the only North Korean designation was March 31st, and it was of North Koreans. Now, it was North Koreans outside of North Korea, which is a good first step, but you need to go after third-party people. They had no problem going after a Chinese scheme inside China for Iran yesterday. So they need to start taking that same attitude, because there are multiple ones inside China for North Korea.
And we know who these people are? I mean, is
Well,
it kind of easy to
just
find
being
them?
on the outside, no longer on the inside of government, there are multiple that are being exposed, it seems like, every month. There was one exposed by the Wall Street Journal earlier this month, and a couple months before, Reuters exposed another. There was a network that was exposed last year by C480S, so I think there are others that will start to come up. But this is the job of the U.S. government. The U.S. government should be exposing I talk to banks. Banks are not going to be able to stop every China-U.S. transaction. They need help, and the help is in the form of the U.S. government. And the way that the U.S. government should do that is publicly identifying all of these front companies.
Harry, what does Kim Jong Un want? What drives him?
Simple, survival. I think Kim Jong Un, there's a lot of analysis out there that calls him crazy. Well, he is crazy. He's crazy like a fox to try and ensure his own survival. He's crazy in the respect that obviously has, like I said, a brutal regime that has these prison camps, that doesn't care about his own people. But his number one thing that he is trying to do to survive, it's basic human psychology, to guarantee that his regime will survive for as long as it can. And that's why he wants nuclear weapons. That's why he's putting so much money, time, and effort. And that's why he will keep testing these weapons.
So he'll never give it up. So really, there's no solution here.
No, I don't think so. The only way I see this situation really playing out, and I agree with Anthony, I think sanctions are a great idea. We need to keep putting the pressure on them as much as possible. But I think for our greatest hope is for this regime to change. Now, militarily, that's a very difficult thing to do because you could be talking about millions of people dying in a war like that. But I think what we need to be doing is doing everything we can to empower the North Korean people, as hard as that is, to try and change this from within the inside. That's the best way to try and solve this problem.
Why did he have his half-brother assassinated?
There's always been a lot of talk about China using his half-brother to basically replace him, and essentially so North Korea would be even more of a puppet of China. So I think what Kim has tried to do, he has tried to knock off anybody that would be a threat to him, whether it was his half-brother, his uncle. He's killed off many of his generals and done it in the most brutal ways possible to send a signal to anybody who would oppose him. This isn't going to work out very well for you. It's probably the worst thing you'd want to be on this planet is the number 2 to Kim Jong Un because you're probably going to die. So that is his motivation more than anything else. It's simple survival.
You think he's going to assassinate more people in his inner circle, or?
Absolutely. Anybody who feels a threat, they're gone. It's very simple.
So this brings us now to his chemical weapons. You mentioned it before. Mm-hmm. This assassination was an illegal chemical weapon.
Right.
Why is he building an arsenal of that? What would he do with chemical weapons?
Well, simple. If there was ever sort of any military confrontation, he would not only have nuclear weapons, and he'd have we think he's probably has somewhere around 100 to 130 different types of missiles to launch those nuclear weapons. But also having 5,000 tons of chemical weapons, he can take that arsenal, put it on missiles, and combine that with nuclear weapons. So imagine this type of battlefield where Kim Jong Un is firing nuclear weapons at Seoul, at Tokyo, at Guam, and at the same time firing chemical munitions, possibly also biological weapons. We think he might have those as well. We're talking about essentially World War III. At least we're talking World War II on steroids. We're talking millions of people dying. We're talking large sections of the Asia Pacific, some of the most prime real estate, Seoul, Tokyo, potentially being uninhabitable. These are the stakes that we're talking about with North Korea. This is no joke. This is the most serious foreign policy and national security crisis the Trump administration has to handle.
Yet the South Koreans, in a landslide, elect this guy who's a progressive, and he's saying, we need to be more conciliatory with the North. This is Moon Jae-in, and he said, quote, "We need to learn how to say no to the U.S." It's as if we're the problem, not North Korea?
Well, I think this is just domestic politics at play more than anything else. I mean, the party that he comes from and sort of the more leftist elements in South Korea have done this for a long time. Prior sort of left-leaning administrations in South Korea have had sunshine policies towards North Korea where they try to have talks with North Korea, try to sort of bring them into the international community, and guess what? It's always failed, unfortunately. So I have a feeling we're going to repeat history once again. We're going to go down this track again where the South Koreans are going to try to warm the North Koreans up. They're going to try to bring them in. Who knows?
It's not going to work.
You could see a summit or something like that, but at the end of the day...
Or they can undo everything that we're trying to do.
Right, exactly.
So, okay, nothing's worked. We've been trying this for at least 30 years. Do we just live with this and hope that there isn't that mistake or that miscalculation or...
Well, the thing about North Korea is it has a great weakness. Its people at least up until the last decade or so, have been very isolated from the outside world. But that's starting to change. You see DVD players starting to come in. A lot of North Koreans have cell phones now, and they're learning actually how to hack their cell phones to be able to make outside calls, to be able to get their internet on their cell phones. So the North Korean people are slowly starting to understand that they are not living in the workers' paradise, that they aren't living in the best place on earth. They're starting to understand that. And I think if the most important thing that we can do is not military regime change, because that's pretty much off the table. That would come at a very high cost. But what we can do is if we can empower ordinary North Koreans that are living there to understand the environment that they're in and that there is a better path, I think that's our best option here more than anything else.
And how do we do that? Like radio broadcasts into the country, that kind of thing? Maybe we can drop stuff.
That is being done in a private effort, but I think if the United States government really put a lot of dollars and a lot of effort into trying to educate the people as much as possible, radio broadcasts are possible. Actually trying to get DVD players into the country that have USB sticks that will actually, broadcast what's happening in the outside world. I mean, look what happened with the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, how it collapsed so quickly. It came from the people because they learned how the outside world worked and they learned that they were basically being put down. If we can educate people in that same way, I think it would have a positive impact.
Harry, thanks so much. Anthony, thanks for being on the program.
Thanks for having us.
This has been the Mimi Geerges Show. You can see all of our programs on WHUT.org and YouTube. Connect with us on Facebook and Twitter and leave me your comments there. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me again next time.